So, Marshall, can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to organising work? And as importantly, what has sustained you in this organising work?
I wonder if I could just take a moment about the present moment.
Absolutely.
When it comes to democracy in my country, we are at what we can call a rock bottom moment. And it's going to get worse before it gets better, which is a problem not just for us, but for those with whom our country interacts. And I think it's important to acknowledge where we are. Now, your institutions are much stronger than ours, really, especially in terms of representation, proximity, and so forth. So, but the thing about rock bottom moments are they can be moments when we realize that what we've been doing is just going to put us in the same place. And so they can be moments in which it's really clear change is what has to happen. And we can't just go back to doing what we were doing. Oh, we'll do it a little better. It's different kind of moment. And the uncertainty is so great. My friend Tom Hayden used to say, change is slow except when it's fast. And we're in a fast moment right now. Now, the thing about fast moments under these circumstances are that there's so much uncertainty and so much unpredictability. And so under these circumstances, how do you engage with that? Now, since no one can predict the future, and under conditions of such uncertainty, it's even a more challenging project, optimism and pessimism, I think, are both arrogant because they claim to predict the future. Everything's going to turn out all right. Everything's going to be horrible. Okay. Now, hope is much more realistic. And I just want to say something about hope because it's not flowers in May, la-di-da. The 12th century philosopher Maimonides had an understanding of hope that was, the idea was that it's belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. In other words, it is always probable Goliath will win, but sometimes David does. It was utterly improbable we'd elect a black man president of my country in 2007, but it happened. In other words, it is this domain between fantasy and certainty. It's the domain of could be, the domain of possibility, a domain which is so fundamental for strategy, for creativity, for imagination. And the thing about it is we often look for hope out there. Oh, who is going to be the great leader? Or who's got the 10-year perfect plan? Well, the reality, though, we're looking in the wrong place. How many people in this room have had an experience of hurt? Let me see, raise your hand if you had an experience of hurt. If you're on this planet, that's likely. Yeah. What about experiences of hope? Have you had experiences of hope? See, if you hadn't had the first, you wouldn't think the world needed fixing. But if you hadn't had the second, you wouldn't be in this room. And sometimes we look out there for what's really in here. And that is so important because we're not looking for, we can be and often are sources of hope and possibility, especially when we engage with one another, especially when we enhance that through empathetic relationship connection with others. So my point is that it's so important that we respect our own capacities, our own resources, our own experience on which to base our response to such an uncertain and problematic time. And for me, organizing is one way to think about how to do that. Now, I want to recognize the question. Why did I get into this?
Yeah, I'm guessing there's a mixture of hurt and hope in that as well.
You bet there is. No, I discovered organizing as a calling, not a career. And it was in Mississippi in 1964. As part of the Mississippi Summer Project, we were organizing something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to challenge the segregated white racist Democratic Party. And it was a moment, well, probably the best way I can describe that is that the night before it was time to go to Mississippi, there were about 300 of us being trained in Oxford, Ohio. And we got word that 3 of our party had disappeared. Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. They had gone to investigate the burning of a black church where there had been civil rights activities, hadn't been heard from since in about two days. Bob Moses, who was the lead organizer, called us all together in like a high school assembly room, got up on the stage, he's a very soft-spoken guy, and he said, "We heard what happened to our brothers. We don't know exactly what happened, but we think they're gone." And sure enough, 2 months later, their bullet-riddled, beaten bodies were found buried in a dirt levee where the Klan had buried them after executing them when the county sheriff had turned them over to the Klan for that purpose. Now, we didn't know that, but we kind of knew that. And so Bob said, "Look, I'd like to tell everybody, forget it, go home. I can't. I need to ask you to go. And if you can't, fine. But everybody here's got to make a decision about this because this is real." Utter silence in the room. And that's when you sort of ask yourself, what am I doing here? Why, And, my father was a rabbi, my mother was a teacher. We lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War when he was the chaplain. And this was when, after what we now call the Holocaust, and my great uncle had been deported from Paris to Auschwitz. And my 5th birthday party was in a DP camp, displaced person camp, that was just children, which at first I thought was pretty cool until I realized why it was only children. The parents were gone. Now, I'm grateful especially to my mother for making clear to me that that wasn't just about anti-Semitism, it was about racism. You turn people into objects and you can kill them. And that horror was so real. And of course, the civil rights movement was challenging the deeply embedded institutionalized racism in my country since before its founding. Now, I don't know, are there any PKs here? People know what a PK is? Really? No? How about IKs? How about RKs? I know there's at least one RK. There's an RK over there. Yeah. Okay. Rabbi's kid. PK, preacher's kid, pastor's kid. IK, imam's kid. Now, let me ask again, any PKs? Really? I think it's going to change that. Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, that's cool. No, the deal is that you're supposed to go to all the stuff. You have to show up everywhere. And you're also supposed to be perfect, which is a different support group for that. But I did love the Passover Seders, the telling of that story of a journey from slavery to freedom, in which they would point to the children and say, "You were slaves in Egypt." I said, "I've never been a slave. I've never been to Egypt." It took me a while to figure out what it meant was that that story was not of the past, it's of the present. And you have to figure out, are you with the guys with the chariots and the horses, or are you with people trying to find their way to a land of promise? And Dr. King described the civil rights movement as yet another chapter in that story. Now, I was 20 at the time. Others were 21, 22, 18, 19. Civil rights movement was the young person's movement. And there's a Protestant theologian, Walter Brueggemann, who wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination, which he says that transformational vision occurs at the intersection of criticality, a clear view of the world's hurt, of its need, of its pain, coupled with hope, a sense of its promise and possibility. One without the other goes to despair or it goes to apathy. But together they can be a powerful source, the tension can be a powerful source of transformational energy and vision. Young people come of age with a critical eye on the world they find, and almost of necessity, hopeful hearts. So these were some of these reflections, and I want to add one other thing, because what really sort of touched me about what was going on in Mississippi, aside from all this, was my father was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And what it meant was that he could not be present to me or to my mother. At the same time, I was required every Friday night to be there listening to my father do his work as a rabbi does, when I wanted to be at the football game where everybody else was. But it was more than that. It was like I was being forced to be someone I was not. And it developed a lot of anger in me. And so after 13, when I was bar mitzvah, I went away as fast as I could. And I think what resonated with me was that was the kind of arbitrary power that was exercised every day in the American South. You do it because I say so. You do it because I got the club. You do it. That kind of pushed my button. And I think that anger combined with the other sources of hopefulness is really what drew me into this kind of work. Because when I got, well, we were all sitting there in silence when a young woman named Jean Wheeler, who was an organizer for SNCC, stood up in the back. She started to sing. I say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say freedom is a constant struggle. Oh, Lord, we've struggled so long, we must be free. We say freedom costs too much dying. We've died too long, we must be free. And as she stood up and began to walk out of the room, everybody filed in behind her, and everybody went to Mississippi the next day. Now, for me, that was a turning point because it was in Mississippi that I discovered this calling that had to do with working with people to support their finding their own voices, finding their own courage to assert their dignity, and doing so in collaboration with others so they could build the power to transform the circumstances responsible for their problem in the first place. And that was called organizing. And so instead of going back to school, I stayed in the South for another year. I wrote him a letter, how can I come back and study history when we're busy making history, which was arrogant, but also true. Okay. And I went back home where I grew up in Bakersfield, California, where César Chávez had just begun organizing migrant farm workers, mostly immigrants from Mexico. And I had to go to Mississippi, really, to get what we called Mississippi Eyes, to come back home and see another community of people of color, also without political rights, also with no economic protections, and California, with its own rich history of racial oppression, going back to the native peoples, Chinese, Japanese, and so forth. So it turned out that Mississippi was not an exception to America, it was an example of the America we needed to change. So the next 16 years, I learned the craft of organizing, working really with César and in the farm worker movement, in politics, in community organizing, boycotts, and all the rest. I left after 16 years, did another 10 years of electoral and union organizing, mostly in California. And that's when I got invited to my 25th reunion at Harvard, even though I was a dropout. And, I wasn't a dropout who started a software company up in Seattle. I wasn't a dropout who started a platform that is rather well known around the world now, where people pretend to have relationships, or maybe they do. But I was feeling stuck, and so I went. And it was like running into a 20-year-old version of me who said, how's it going? I said, I'm feeling stuck. Why don't you come back, finish that senior year? I don't know, the synapses, I don't know, the tuition had changed. But we figured it out, so I came back in 1991, wrote my senior thesis in history and government, and graduated class of 64-92, and my 81-year-old mother got to come and see her son finally become a college graduate. So that led me back to the world of the academy. And what I discovered, because I finished my senior year, did a master's in public policy and a PhD in sociology, but while working on the PhD was asked to design a course in organizing, and for me, teaching was just another version of organizing. In other words—
Can you speak a bit more to that? Like, what is it about teaching that you feel that connect?
Well, for me, it was a way to integrate my life experience, the social science I was learning, in a pedagogical conversation with a rising generation. It was like I got to go to class twice a week and have a conversation with the future. I mean, how cool is that? And it's the reason I have continued, because my focus has been the development of a pedagogy of practice, not learning about organizing, but learning the practices that are fundamental for organizing. not learning about stories, but learning how to actually use stories. And so it becomes a source of constant learning and renewal, especially as people you work with go into the world and adapt and learn. And so that comes back into the teaching. So it's kind of a teaching, research, practice kind of loop. And I'm just curious, how many people here have been in our online organizing or public narrative class? Would you raise your hand? That's pretty cool, and you still came. It's great. No, but what it has enabled me to do was have the opportunity to learn with people, literally from all over the world, in how to do this work of enabling people to find their courage, do so with others, and turn that into power. And so that's why I say, for me, teaching's recruiting, really. And then it becomes leadership development, and that's what it's all about. And then that becomes supporting people as they turn this into sources of power.
And I know that there's a lot more on your story, but we're also here because you wrote a book, Marshall, called People, Power, Change. And what motivated you to do that? What is it that, you're wanting to leave with people?
Well, all these years of practice and teaching, writing was something that I was supposed to do. It was challenging. In fact, there was a whole action organized on me.
Yes, there was.
Yes, by Harihan and Liz McKenna confronted me one day and said, look, you going to write this book or not? And they said, we're going to get a group of people together who want you to write this book at Santa Barbara University on this date. And, it's, do or don't. Like Yoda says, there is no try, just do. And so that's what happened, and I'm so grateful for it. I had a book doula, actually, Liz McKenna, who helped me do this. Because it's hard when you're drawn into the action and you're staring at that computer screen. But boy, I am so grateful for that because it's offered me a way to think more deeply and to share more broadly the opportunities that I've had to learn with others about fundamentals. And what really provoked the book was the state of affairs which has led us to Trump. Because that didn't happen yesterday. That did not happen yesterday. It's rooted actually in the fact that the United States tried to build a system, a constitutional system, that was based on two competing ideas. One was the governed should govern, equal voice. The other was that some should govern and others obey, unequal voice. And, the US was both systems. See, when people say, oh, Trump's not us, no, Trump is us. And it's got to be acknowledged because the institutionalization of slavery created a whole other American tradition that has been in tension with the other one. And they've been in tension over the years, and it's one reason we have a constitution that is so oligarchic and not democratic. I mean, it's electoral college. What's democratic about that? The American Senate, nothing democratic about that. The first by the post system, which we have, which you also have, but because of the fact that there have been no restraints on campaign spending, since the Supreme Court said that money is speech, there's been an infinite demand, and it created an electoral industrial complex that has transformed politics into marketing. And so it's been taking people out and putting data points in. And so when you put those two things together, you get a system that is very problematic, that it enables minorities to stop everything or to take power. And so you could see that coming. You could see it coming. And it wasn't my intention to have a book published along with Trump's re-election. Sadly, it turned out to be very timely. But that's it, because I think unless we develop the capacity to see power in people, not in data points, not in dollar bills, then we lose the democratic project. We lose that. And, we don't have parties. We have marketing. We have two markets. We have a Republican market, Democratic market. Entrepreneurial candidates compete for the brand, And that's what happens. And I went to a session at Harvard after the general election. They have a session with, oh, stop, I will in a minute. They came to a session, they have a session with the campaign management of both the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign in the same room for a day and a half, which is pretty interesting. It's hard for them to lie because they know each other's tricks and so forth. But I came away with the clear understanding that the Harris campaign in my country was trying to tell people how they ought to feel rather than listening to how they felt. And the arrogance of that, but also the isolation of that, well, the New York Times had a recording of a reporter that went with an organizer in Wisconsin after Kamala was nominated, door to door, and they come to the door, a woman comes out, the organizer says, you must really care about choice. She says, well, climate, educate. He starts going down a list. How do I categorize this person so that we can target this person for the appropriate messaging on a stimulus response basis as if it was not a human being? And that substitution of labels and categories for human beings, you do not build people-based politics that way. And to me, that's our challenge, is to bring people back into the center of our political system and our political project so that we can move on with this progress of democracy, which is such a great promise, but sadly not nearly fulfilled as it needs to be and as it ought to be.
Thank you, Marshall.